Also, I wanted to do just a quick movie review. I know I don't really do those. I've been meaning to talk about movies and stuff, but there are so many better vloggers out there doing it. Just tonight, when I got back from work and I crashed, I was listening to the AVGN, and of course, he's great, and so is Decker Shadow and all these others, but they don't really review religious movies. The only one that I know who reviews religious movies does it just ironically to make fun of them, to take the piss out of them. That would be Hugo and Jake. But anyway, I saw a really phenomenal movie about church history and about Paul. It's called Paul the Apostle of Christ. My older brother recommended it to me. And I think he knows one of the people that was involved in the making of the film, someone out in Chicago or something. But I was able to watch it Sunday night, and I was just really amazed by it. It follows the very end of the life of Paul, as Paul is in prison in Rome, and he's dictating the last of his messages to the Christian world as he's waiting for his execution. They've announced that he is going to be killed, and it leads up to the very end of his life, and it's his communication with Luke, who visits him in the prison in Rome to get the last bit of wisdom that he can find. And it struck me as seeing for the first time the persecution of Christians in early Rome, which I've always known about, which I've read about in the scriptures, of course, but it was amazing to see it, to see reenactments of putting Roman candles where they would light Christians on fire to light the city, to see a group of Christians being pushed out to the games where they would all be slaughtered by different animals. And these are Christians of different nationalities, different tribes, different ages. There are children and old men and women with them. And there's that horror, that sense of horror as they're being tossed to the lions, and the crowd is jeering. And Luke reminds them that it's just a moment of pain before they're with God in paradise. And those scenes, it always cuts away from the most gruesome bit, but you see them walking, you see the captured Christians walking into the Colosseum. And it almost reminds me of like the gas chamber scene in Schindler's List, or in those horrific Holocaust movies where you see families being pushed to their death, even children. And it's just hard to imagine that happened in history. And that child sacrifice was such a thing. Going back, looking at the Old Testament, you see so many cases where, for example, Samson kills 1,000 people with a jawbone, or God destroys the entire world prior to the flood, saving only Noah and his family. And you think, wow, that's really cruel of God. But to consider that child sacrifice was such a thing, practiced by the Canaanites and practiced in Rome, where they would just freely kill children. It's hard to imagine that that stuff isn't deserving of punishment. And anyway, some very heavy themes in this film, but also some very positive messages. At the very end, you look at Paul, and you look at how he is committed to turning the other cheek and being a pacifist and showing kindness and love and mercy in spite of all that's happening to them in Rome, in spite of Christians among them saying we should rise up and we should defeat the Romans. Paul and Luke have such tremendous faith and tremendous belief in Jesus that they refuse to take up arms, and instead do the healing work even for the people that are persecuting them, even going so far as to help Mauritius Gallas, the Roman official, helping his sick daughter. They go out of their way in spite of them being persecuted, in spite of having their people killed, in spite of facing death sentences. Anyway, there's so much to be said about this film, so much to be said about this history. And while the story itself, I mean, I didn't follow exactly what scriptures it was following, but I believe it was from mostly the book of Acts. And it even goes into some detail about writing the New Testament in Greek, which I found interesting, where it goes through Luke and Paul negotiating the final words of the the New Testament, really. But looking at the movie itself, I was really impressed with the cinematography, the use of light, the use of fire, the use of shadow to really pull you in. And it's all stable shots. It's not the kind of disjointed, weird, violent stuff that you'd find in like old Quentin Tarantino movies, or even that I thought The Passion of the Christ suffered a little bit from, where it was all swaying cameras and all that. I mean, of course, there are nightmare sequences and stuff like that in this film, but it's also very level and very set and very easy to follow for most of it, especially if you are familiar with the story. But even if you're not as familiar with the story of Paul in Rome, it's definitely a good primer on that, and it's definitely something that will get you interested in more. So I definitely recommend this, and thanks to my brother for suggesting it to me. So please check out Paul, Apostle of Christ, released in spring of this year. Over and out.